Gospel Topics Essays, Plural Marriage and Families in Early Utah. In this series, I will thoroughly examine the Gospel Topics essays published on the official LDS Church website. Each essay will be addressed in the order presented by the Church, offering a critical and in-depth analysis of the topics they cover. As the LDS Church continues to break this down into further in-depth articles, I will be exposing their distortions and contradictions in follow-up videos, addressing each point in the order they present it. The Church opens with, "The Bible and the Book of Mormon teach that the marriage of one man to one woman is God's standard, except specific periods when He has declared otherwise." We won't linger long here. I've already covered this in depth in other Gospel Topics Essays videos. But let's make one thing absolutely clear. Nowhere in the Old or New Testament does God ever command polygamy. Was it practiced? Yes. Was it divinely mandated? Not once. Now turning to the book of Jacob in the Book of Mormon, roughly 8 verses outright condemn plural marriage with just one vague exception. Even if we play devil's advocate and accept Jacob 2:30 as a loophole, we're still left with a glaring contradiction. Where are the children from Joseph Smith's many plural marriages in Kirtland and Nauvoo? If polygamy was meant to raise up seed, as the justification goes, then why is there no seed? Where is the children from the others practicing it? Former insiders like John C. Bennett and even Hiram Smith claim that Bennett performed abortions for Joseph Smith and other high-ranking leaders. If that's true, then this wasn't about multiplying the righteous. It was about concealing the consequences. The entire rationale collapses. The Church proceeds with, "In accordance with a revelation to Joseph Smith, the practice of plural marriage, the marriage of one man to 2 or more women, was instituted among members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the early 1840s. Thereafter, for more than half a century, plural marriage was practiced by some Latter-day Saints. Only the church president held the keys authorizing the performance of new plural marriages. In 1890, the Lord-inspired church president Wilford Woodruff to issue a statement that led to the end of the practice of plural marriage in the church. In this statement, known as the Manifesto, President Woodruff declared his intention to abide by U.S. law forbidding plural marriage and to use his influence to convince members of the church to do likewise. Let's set the record straight. Fanny Alger was Joseph Smith's first known plural wife, taken in 1834 or 1835. When the church later abandoned polygamy, it wasn't because God changed his mind. It was because the federal government was closing in. The Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887 disincorporated the church, revoked women's voting rights in Utah, dissolved the Perpetual Emigrating Fund, and gave the government power to seize all LDS assets over $50,000. That's what forced Woodruff's hand. But don't be fooled. John Taylor was already preparing for this. His priesthood council plan claimed that true church authority didn't rest with its public organization, but with the higher priesthood, especially the Council of 50. In a revelation dated September 27, 1886, Taylor claimed that Jesus Christ reaffirmed the unbreakable nature of plural marriage. The revelation declared that not even the church president could revoke the new and everlasting covenant. It was never canonized, but it's treated as scripture by Mormon fundamentalists. According to testimonies given by Lauren C. Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s, Taylor met secretly with a group of trusted men the night he received that revelation. Woolley claimed Taylor laid hands on 5 men, including himself and his father, John W. Woolley, and set them apart to continue the practice of plural marriage regardless of what the institutional church did. This group would eventually become the root of the modern fundamentalist movement. Historian D. Michael Quinn wrote, "Regardless of the 1890 Manifesto and its public repudiation of polygamy, the 1886 revelation and the authority said to be conferred that night became the foundational event in the priesthood lineage claimed by virtually every Mormon fundamentalist group. The Mormon Hierarchy, Extensions of Power, p. 146. So when Woodruff issued the Manifesto, he wasn't following revelation. He was capitulating to federal pressure and financial collapse. This was about legal survival, not divine instruction. The public church surrendered. The underground church didn't. The church then states, after the manifesto, monogamy was advocated in the church both over the pulpit and through the press. On an exceptional basis, some new plural marriages were performed between 1890 and 1904, especially in Mexico and Canada, outside the jurisdiction of U.S. law. A small number of plural marriages were performed within the United States during those years. In 1904, the church strictly prohibited new plural marriages. Today, any person who practices plural marriage cannot become or remain a member of the church. This essay primarily addresses plural marriage as practiced by the Latter-day Saints between 1847 and 1890, following their exodus to the U.S. West and before the manifesto. If the manifesto truly ended polygamy, why did church leaders continue authorizing secret plural marriages for over a decade, including in the U.S.? Preaching monogamy publicly while practicing polygamy privately isn't divine obedience, it's deliberate deception, and it did not stop there. Between 1890 and 1904, at least 132 plural marriages were performed within the United States, not just abroad, and they were not rogue operations. Senior church leaders, including apostles and even church presidents, authorized them behind closed doors. Historian D. Michael Quinn writes, more than 250 polygamous marriages were performed between 1890 and 1904, and at least 132 of these were performed within the United States, not just in Mexico or Canada. The Mormon Hierarchy, Extensions of Power, p. 123. Apostles John W. Taylor and Matthias F. Cowley were the most active, and both were forced to resign in 1905 for continuing to perform plural marriages. Presidents Lorenzo Snow and Wilford Woodruff were also tied to these secret authorizations, especially in the immediate years following the 1890 manifesto. These marriages took place in secret, in temples, outlying settlements, and beyond legal oversight. Despite public denials, church leadership deliberately prolonged polygamy until mounting political pressure, especially the Reed-Smoot hearings, forced them to stop with the Second Manifesto in 1904. The church moves on with, Latter-day Saints do not understand all of God's purposes for instituting, through his prophets, the practice of plural marriage during the 19th century. The Book of Mormon identifies one reason for God to command it, to increase the number of children born in the gospel covenant in order to raise up seed unto the Lord. Jacob 2, verse 30. Plural marriage did result in the birth of large numbers of children within faithful Latter-day Saint homes. It also shaped 19th century Mormon society in other ways. Marriage became available to virtually all who desired it. Per capita inequality of wealth was diminished as economically disadvantaged women married into more financially stable households, and ethnic intermarriages were increased, which helped to unite a diverse immigrant population. Plural marriage also helped create and strengthen a sense of cohesion and group identification among Latter-day Saints. Church members came to see themselves as a peculiar people, covenant-bound to carry out the commands of God, despite outside opposition, willing to endure ostracism for their principles. The church's claim that plural marriage was commanded to raise up seed falls flat the moment you look at the historical record. Where are the children from Joseph Smith's dozens of wives? Outside of a disputed case or two, there aren't any. And if producing children was the divine goal, why do accounts from people like John C. Bennett and even Hiram Smith describe abortion practices being carried out in secret? Let's be clear, Jacob 2:30 doesn't command polygamy. It condemns it, with only one vague exception that still doesn't justify the lies, coercion, and betrayal that defined early LDS plural marriage. The idea that polygamy somehow created economic equality or social cohesion is a laughable backfill narrative. In practice, it concentrated power in the hands of elite male leaders and turned women into spiritual leverage. The diverse immigrant population argument is window dressing. Young girls as young as 14 were taken as wives by much older men, not to unite cultures, but to fulfill supposed eternal mandates dictated by charismatic patriarchs. And the claim that plural marriage built group identity? Sure, in the same way that high-demand cult tactics do, through isolation, sacrifice, and manufactured persecution complexes. The claim that plural marriage was meant to raise up seed falls apart when you look at the actual outcomes. For the majority of Latter-day Saints, polygamy didn't result in an increase in families. It was primarily leaders like Brigham Young and Joseph F. Smith whose families expanded significantly through plural marriage, while the vast majority of plural marriages, particularly those among rank-and-file members, did not lead to large families. Monogamous Mormon women in Utah averaged 6.8 children per family. In contrast, plural wives averaged 3.6 children per wife, a smaller number per individual, but collectively, a single husband could father 20 or more children. So, while some plural marriages resulted in more children, they did so at the expense of many women who had fewer children than monogamous wives, and primarily benefited a select few men who used the practice to expand their own personal families. This wasn't about building righteous posterity in the broader community. It was about elites consolidating power and maintaining control, while the vast majority of the faithful were left with hardships, secrecy, and coercion, all while polygamy was sold as a divine mandate. This wasn't about raising seed. It wasn't about social progress. It was about control, loyalty, and power, dressed up in Scripture to keep the rank and file in line. The Church proceeds with, for these early Latter-day Saints, plural marriage was a religious principle that required personal sacrifice. Accounts left by men and women who practiced plural marriage attest to the challenges and difficulties they experienced, such as financial difficulty, interpersonal strife, and some wives longing for the sustained companionship of their husbands. But accounts also record the love and joy many found within their families. They believed it was a commandment of God at that time, and that obedience would bring great blessings to them and their posterity, both on earth and in the life to come. While there was much love, tenderness, and affection within many plural marriages, the practice was generally based more on religious belief than on romantic love. Church leaders taught that participants in plural marriages should seek to develop a generous spirit of unselfishness and the pure love of Christ for everyone involved. Sacrifice was not the word for many women in plural marriages. Many plural wives lived in isolation, sometimes in remote settlements or separate homes to avoid legal prosecution. This separation often led to neglect or abandonment. Some men, under pressure from federal anti-polygamy laws, especially the Edmunds Act of 1882 and the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887, fled or went into hiding, leaving their plural wives to fend for themselves. Others divorced or informally separated to protect themselves legally. As D. Michael Quinn noted in the Mormon Hierarchy, extensions of power that, by the late 1880s, church leaders had to contend with a growing number of polygamous families falling apart under the strain of persecution, exile, and economic hardship, a reality that plural wives often bore alone. We also have Relief Society records and diaries of abandoned women showing that many ended up relying on church welfare or extended family, while others were simply left behind. How was this bring great blessings to them and their posterity, both on earth and in the life to come? The Church states, during the years that plural marriage was publicly taught, all Latter-day Saints were expected to accept the principle as a revelation from God. Not all, however, were expected to live it. Indeed, this system of marriage could not have been universal due to the ratio of men to women. Church leaders viewed plural marriage as a command to the church generally, while recognizing that individuals who did not enter the practice could still stand approved of God. Women were free to choose their spouses, whether to enter into a polygamous or monogamous union, or whether to marry at all. Some men entered plural marriage because they were asked to do so by church leaders, while others initiated the process themselves. All were required to obtain the approval of church leaders before entering a plural marriage. Brigham Young declared, "The only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy." This wasn't a suggestion, it was a mandate. Under Young's leadership, plural marriage wasn't optional for the faithful, it was the gateway to godhood. The modern LDS Church has retrofitted and sanitized this doctrine, deliberately downplaying how central polygamy was to salvation during the 19th century. Joseph F. Smith confirmed the consistency of this belief, stating, Some of the leading men in the church have told me that they have heard the prophet Joseph Smith teach that a man could not be exalted unless he had more than one wife. This wasn't just Brigham Young's theology. Its roots trace directly back to Joseph Smith himself. Apostle Orson Pratt reinforced it. We cannot be exalted in the eternal worlds and gain a fullness of celestial glory without observing the law of celestial marriage. And during this era, celestial marriage clearly meant plural marriage, not simply eternal monogamy. The doctrine was plain: no polygamy, no exaltation. But as legal pressure mounted and public image became more important, the church quietly rewrote the rules. What was once framed as an eternal law suddenly became negotiable. That shift wasn't revelation, it was self-preservation. The church moves on with. The passage of time shaped the experience of life within plural marriage. Virtually all of those practicing it in the earliest years had to overcome their own prejudice against plural marriage and adjust to life in polygamous families. The task of pioneering a semi-arid land during the middle decades of the 19th century added to the challenges of families who were learning to practice the principle of plural marriage. Where the family lived, whether in Salt Lake City, with its multiple social and cultural opportunities, or the rural hinterlands, where such opportunities were fewer in number, made a difference in how plural marriage was experienced. It is therefore difficult to accurately generalize about the experience of all plural marriages. Still, some patterns are discernible, and they correct some myths. Although some leaders had large polygamous families, 2/3 of polygamist men had only 2 wives at a time. Church leaders recognized that plural marriages could be particularly difficult for women. Divorce was therefore available to women who were unhappy in their marriages. Remarriage was also readily available. Women did marry at fairly young ages in the first decade of Utah settlement, age 16 or 17, or, infrequently, younger, which was typical of women living in frontier areas at the time. As in other places, women married at older ages as the society matured. Almost all women married, and so did a large percentage of men. In fact, it appears that a larger percentage of men in Utah married than elsewhere in the United States at the time. Probably half of those living in Utah Territory in 1857 experienced life in a polygamous family as a husband, wife, or child at some time during their lives. By 1870, 25 to 30% of the population lived in polygamous households, and it appears that the percentage continued to decrease over the next 20 years. This statement attempts to deflect from the fundamental problems of plural marriage by reframing it as a matter of geography or personal adjustment, rather than one of systemic harm and coercion. The passage of time did not nobly shape the experience. It obscured the trauma. For many women, plural marriage was not a spiritual calling but a requirement under threat of social isolation, divine condemnation, or ecclesiastical punishment. The reality is this: plural marriage institutionalized inequality. Husbands held disproportionate power, often abandoning wives or providing minimal support, especially in outlying settlements. The difficulty in generalizing is a convenient way to sidestep overwhelming evidence of emotional suffering, neglect, and abandonment documented in journals, affidavits, and memoirs of 19th century Mormon women. This was not just a rough adjustment to pioneer life. It was the forced accommodation of a deeply flawed doctrine. First, the claim that marrying at 16 or 17 was typical for frontier women is misleading. Census data and historical scholarship, including the work of historian Todd Compton, shows that the average marrying age for white frontier women in the mid-1800s was around 23 years old. In contrast, Mormon plural marriages often involved girls as young as 14 or 15, a significant and disturbing deviation from the national frontier norm, especially when those girls were sealed to men decades older. That's not culturally typical. That's religiously driven coercion. Second, the idea that 2/3 of polygamist men had only 2 wives doesn't lessen the systemic inequality. One man having multiple wives still meant a gender imbalance, competition, and limited prospects for monogamous men. It also ignores how church leadership encouraged and elevated plural marriage as a divine requirement, creating a power dynamic where compliance was tied to salvation. Why is it that the LDS leadership had a significant amount of wives compared to the laymen within the church? Heber C. Kimball had 43 children from 17 wives. Wilford Woodruff had 33 children from 9 wives. Brigham Young had 56 children from at least 55 wives. As for divorce and remarriage being readily available, this is another distortion. Divorce was legally possible, yes, but culturally and religiously stigmatized, especially for women. In many cases, leaving a plural marriage meant losing community support, church standing, and even custody of children. That's not liberation, it's entrapment under the guise of doctrine. And finally, framing the decline in polygamous households as a natural social evolution is disingenuous. The decline was driven by external legal pressure, including anti-polygamy legislation and the federal seizure of church assets, not internal enlightenment. The system didn't soften because it matured. It was forced to change because it was unsustainable and morally indefensible. The church moves on with, the experience of plural marriage toward the end of the 19th century was substantially different from that of earlier decades. Beginning in 1862, the U.S. government passed laws against the practice of plural marriage. Outside opponents mounted a campaign against the practice, stating that they hoped to protect Mormon women and American civilization. For their part, many Latter-day Saint women publicly defended the practice of plural marriage, arguing in statements that they were willing participants. After the U.S. Supreme Court found the anti-polygamy laws to be constitutional in 1879, federal officials began prosecuting polygamous husbands and wives during the 1880s. Believing these laws to be unjust, Latter-day Saints engaged in civil disobedience by continuing to practice plural marriage and by attempting to avoid arrest. When convicted, they paid fines and submitted to jail time. To help their husbands avoid prosecution, plural wives often separated into different households or went into hiding under assumed names, particularly when pregnant or after giving birth. This narrative paints an oversimplified, romanticized version of late 19th century plural marriage and conveniently sidesteps the coercive hierarchical system that surrounded it. Yes, some Latter-day Saint women publicly defended polygamy, but many did so under extreme social, religious, and familial pressure. When the church teaches that plural marriage is necessary for exaltation and that obedience to male priesthood leaders is divinely mandated, consent becomes a blurred concept. Public statements by women in favor of polygamy were often curated for propaganda purposes, particularly during government crackdowns. This wasn't widespread empowerment, it was spiritual and social coercion. The idea that Latter-day Saints engaged in noble civil disobedience misrepresents what was happening. These were not individual protests against injustice, but an organized effort by a theocratic institution to preserve control. Church leaders continued to promote and conceal plural marriages, despite clear federal law, putting women in legally precarious and emotionally devastating positions. Many plural wives were hidden, moved from home to home, used aliases, and lived in fear, all to protect the church and its leaders, not out of personal conviction. And let's be clear, women going into hiding while pregnant or just after giving birth isn't an act of bold defiance. It's a tragic reflection of how deeply these women were entangled in a system that prioritized doctrine and leadership authority over their safety, autonomy, and well-being. Sarah Barnes Layton stated, "The struggle to decide whether or not to enter that order of marriage caused me to lose many a night's sleep, and caused me to utter many a fervent prayer to the Lord that He would guide me. I told my Heavenly Father that if He would give me strength, I would obey this principle and would do the best I could, trying to live up to it." Sarah Barnes Layton, reflecting on her decision to become a plural wife in 1852. The church closes the essay with, by 1890, when President Woodruff's manifesto lifted the command to practice plural marriage, Mormon society had developed a strong, loyal core of members, mostly made up of immigrants from Europe and the eastern United States. But the demographic makeup of the worldwide church membership had begun to change. Beginning in the 1890s, converts outside the United States were asked to build up the church in their homelands rather than move to Utah. In subsequent decades, Latter-day Saints migrated away from the Great Basin to pursue new opportunities. plural marriage had never been encouraged outside of concentrated populations of Latter-day Saints. Especially in these newly formed congregations outside of Utah, monogamous families became central to religious worship and learning. As the church grew and spread beyond the American West, the monogamous nuclear family was well suited to an increasingly mobile and dispersed membership. For many who practiced it, plural marriage was a significant sacrifice. Despite the hardships some experienced, the faithfulness of those who practiced plural marriage continues to benefit the church in innumerable ways. Through the lineage of these 19th century saints have come many Latter-day Saints who have been faithful to their gospel covenants as righteous mothers and fathers, loyal disciples of Jesus Christ, and devoted church members, leaders, and missionaries. Although members of the contemporary church are forbidden to practice plural marriage, modern Latter-day Saints honor and respect these pioneers who gave so much for their faith, families, and community. The idea that plural marriage was simply phased out due to shifting demographics and the growth of an increasingly global mobile church ignores the very real historical pressures and legal threats that forced the LDS Church to abandon the practice. The 1890 Manifesto by Wilford Woodruff was not a theological revelation born from global church expansion. It was a legal necessity. The U.S. federal government had intensified its crackdown on polygamy with legislation like the Edmunds Act, 1882, and the Edmunds-Tucker Act, 1887, which stripped the church of its assets and denied polygamists the right to vote, hold office, or serve on juries. These were not minor irritants, but existential threats to the church's institutional survival. The claim that plural marriage had never been encouraged outside of concentrated populations of Latter-day Saints obscures the fact that polygamy was explicitly taught as a requirement for exaltation by top leaders such as Brigham Young, Joseph F. Smith, and Orson Pratt. This was not a regional practice. It was a doctrine with eternal consequences. Converts were not only aware of this, but were sometimes required to accept it to be fully integrated into the faith. The claim that plural marriage was a sacrifice overlooks the coercive nature and emotional toll it took, especially on women who were often married off at young ages and without choice. Many were pressured into these marriages due to religious expectations, not personal sacrifice. The narrative of benefit to the church ignores the ongoing secrecy and hypocrisy as leaders continued to practice polygamy in defiance of the 1890 Manifesto. The abandonment of plural marriage was a response to legal pressure, not a divine revelation, making the idea that it continues to benefit the church highly misleading. The sanitized version of history that emphasizes demographic shifts and international growth as the reason for polygamy's decline erases the moral, legal, and theological contradictions that define the transition. This was not an orderly evolution. It was a messy, often hypocritical unraveling of a doctrine that had been deeply woven into the church's claim to divine authority. Thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for today.